Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the killing of George Floyd, the African-American who was killed by police officers by kneeling on his neck. We, of course, have had now continued protests for a number of days now there across the United States, and in fact, in many parts of the world as well, in solidarity with protesters out there calling for justice, not just for George Floyd, but an end to the systemic racism in the United States and in different parts of the world. It can also be argued. Now, just before coming on air, I was reading about an incident that's taken place in Austin, Texas, of a young man named Justin Howell who was being hit in the head by a non-lethal weapon. However, his skull has now been fractured. Now, Austin PD certainly will come under the spotlight as well, I imagine, throughout the country for exactly what happened in that incident. It's being said that the medics who went to try to help Justin were also then attacked by police officers at that time. This all goes to show the heightened emotions right now playing out on the streets there across the United States, both on the part of police and on the part of protesters. However, of course, what we seem to be losing in the midst of all of this talk about looting and violence, etc., is the main issue itself, the root cause of these protests, and that is, as I already said, systemic racism, which has been so long-standing. It's not as if it's just George Floyd that we're speaking about. There have been so many names before this, such as Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, et cetera, et cetera. Let me put that to our guests now, who are joining us to discuss all of it further. We're now joined by Derrick, Hollie, who is the president of Reaching America, which is an advocacy organization he founded to address social issues impacting African Americans and communities of color. He's joining us now from Bensville, Maryland. We're also joined by Menna, Demessie, who is the vice president of policy analysis and research at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and she's joining us this morning from Cleveland, Ohio. Menna and Derrick, thank you both for your time this morning. Menna, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make, let's just start from the beginning of this entire protest movement now, the killing of George Floyd and exactly what's happened since?
Yeah, you know, it's important for news reporters like you and others to really shed light on these issues. So thank you for doing that. What we're witnessing in this moment requires us to look at the history of institutional discrimination and overt racism since the time of slavery until present. So what you're witnessing is the collective outrage of decades and hundreds of years of discrimination against white supremacy in the name of justice. One cannot look at the issue of George Floyd's murder in isolation. We have numerous examples where the same institution that was established to protect the people have targeted their violence towards Black people, and that's law enforcement. And so when the numbers show, and you look at data across all kinds of socioeconomic indicators, the way law enforcement treats Black people, the unemployment rate, which is where the white unemployment rate is twice as high as the Black unemployment rate. When you're looking at wealth and home ownership, we continue to see these racial disparities that go back to generations of mistreatment and maltreatment against Black people.
Indeed. Derrick, what are your thoughts? What's been your reaction so far to what you've seen playing out on the streets across the U.S.?
The other guest said a lot of stuff that's going on right now, it's not just what happened with George Floyd. It's been a culmination of over 100 years of being oppressed in these cities. And I would say the combination of, obviously, with this COVID-19 virus going on and people being out of work, and then just to see how this man was literally killed on national TV in front of everyone, it just goes to show it's what we've been saying for years. And now America had a firsthand opportunity to view what we've been trying to tell people has been taking place in our neighborhoods and our communities for years. And so what happened was the tipping point. And people are just really, really sick and tired of being sick and tired of everything that's going on in this country as it relates to systemic racism and the oppression that they've been suffering at the hands of law enforcement in the United States.
You know, Menna, there have been some reactions, haven't there, from even those who are pro-Trump in the sense that they're Republicans and or have worked with Trump in the past. So we've had Mattis coming out speaking about how Trump is being divisive instead of uniting the country. We've also even had Republicans coming out and saying the president has not done his duties really in this regard and instead has spoken more about militarization, if need be, of cities across the country. How do you think Donald Trump has handled the situation?
Well, as we can see from the first day of President Trump's presidency, where he, in his first 100 days, established an executive order to ban Muslims from 7 countries and took his position not with the people, but arguably against the people. We've witnessed many of his own appointees and people who stood up in honor of representing government leave because when you have a president who brings back to life the Insurrection Act, which was something used in the early 19th century against slave rebellions like Nat Turner's, and you deploy the military guard against the people of your own country, one has to question who he's talking to and what the end game is here. The right to free speech and the freedom of assembly is the bedrock of our democracy, period. And so to have a president take us 100 years back and put us in danger once again, this is not going to end until something is done. And the fact that we have multiracial coalitions, the fact that hundreds of thousands of people across the country are engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience in the name of those who were murdered by police is something that is true to the American spirit and has been there since slaves were out, basically since slavery was abolished. Okay. And so, it's important that we call out our president when we feel like we're not being represented properly. But the idea that the bedrock of our democracy is at stake here and it's costing human lives. Who do we go to protect us? There are way more protesters than there are looters. And so when he takes his moment to not comfort the people and say, let's look at the situation and make it better, but instead says, we're going to deploy the military guard and looters are shooters, bringing George Wallace's, things back around segregation. It's very scary. It's a very scary time.
Tell me, Derrick, what are your thoughts about how this is more of an establishment issue than an issue of just Donald Trump?
Yes, it is an established issue. Unfortunately, he's having to deal with it right now in the present moment. Okay. The idea, I do believe, though, there have been some missed opportunities for him to address this issue head on. And I give one example is when he went to the church the other day. It was kind of like, okay, where's he going with this? And I think he missed a real opportunity he had the attention of the United States, everyone watching, and it was just a photo op moment. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the last guest and what she said in terms of about military police and that kind of, and the National Guard. The Insurrection Act has actually been used about 7 different times. Most recently, George W. Bush used it during Hurricane Katrina, to restore law and order. Right now, some of these cities, the people that are looting, they're not protesters. The people who are out after 7 and 8 o'clock after these curfews, those are not protesters. A lot of times the media will portray that these people are protesters are peaceful. That is not the case. And if you go down to any of these events for yourself, and you'll see that when they ask you to back up and move, that means back up and move, not lay down in the middle of the street and try to act like somebody knocked you down. So there has to be some law and order restored in some of these cities. And I think, and if the local governments can't get it done, then we may have to look at the Insurrection Act and bringing in some of the Army National Guard to restore order in some of these cities.
Okay, so on that point, then, what are your thoughts about that? Because certainly we can't deny that there has been looting that has occurred, there has been rioting that's occurred, and of course this doesn't mean that this stains everybody who is, of course, peacefully protesting on a very legitimate issue. But how should authorities be responding to the rioters, to the looters?
Sure, you have to protect. And let me just be clear. I said there are more protesters than there are looters. And I think that distinction is not being made. We've heard more statements about looters than we have about hearing more. There are people that want leadership from our president. And it is true that this institutional discrimination started long before President Trump. And if we don't do anything about it, it will last long after he's gone. But the idea that Congress and the president and the powers that be have to step up and assure the people that they are addressing these issues. Again, all these people are not out there just because George Floyd died. And so when you put it out there, I mean, you should also know protesters are also helping defend some of the areas in their own cities that are being targeted by looters, because that is not the point of the movement. And so we need to make sure we have a framework that understands what is happening right now. And people want to hear from the president. They want to understand that their cries are not in vain, that there is an understanding and they're not being met by opposition. At the end of the day, law enforcement is the only institution that has authority to protect the people officially. And so we need people to step up. So sure, we need law and order, but we cannot have institutions or the president himself use law and order and only cast dispersion on looters. What is being done about the issue of police in a systemic way that attacks these issues head on? We know, and the data tells us, that race and racism continue to define in large order racial disparities across a host of socioeconomic indicators, including the way law enforcement treats Black people. So at the end of the day, what you're seeing here are people who are frustrated with a broken system that doesn't work, and we want more focus in that regard.
Okay, so then, Derrick, I mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the first step towards fixing this broken system is proper justice, right? So it would be nice to have proper justice just in the case of George Floyd to begin with, and then, of course, move on to the many, many other cases that we can probably list. Do you think that that is likely to happen? We now know that all 4 officers have been charged with varying degrees, of course, of charges. And for one of them, at least, the degree of charge has been increased. In fact, the main gentleman involved. Do you think that that will be enough to appease the African-American community?
I do think it's a step in the right direction, but is it enough? Absolutely not. It will never be enough, okay, until this systemic racism and this police brutality that continues to exist in this country is removed from all the different departments, police departments across the country. But right now, what you're seeing again is it's come to a boiling point. And until we get rid of not just some of the elected officials in these cities, but these are people who have empowered these police chiefs, these police unions, who have these politicians in their pocket, this is going to continue. So that is the root of the problem. We have to work with these police departments, these police unions, who allowed this kind of activity to go on for years. And so that's where this has to start on the local level. Again, President Trump needs to do a better job of addressing this issue head on from the national level. But in terms of what's going to happen and what needs to take place, it needs to start in our local neighborhoods, our local communities, and our local police departments.
But then, that's a complex issue too, isn't it, Menna, where for so long we've had these socioeconomic disparities, right? Because I was just looking at charts today about inequality amongst, the African-American community and then the Caucasian, the non-Hispanic white community in the U.S. And, the numbers are staggering, aren't they? And the gap keeps growing in some regards and is getting better in some regards, such as unemployment as well. How does one bridge those issues? Because these are all connected, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, look, part of the work for people like myself who do this research is understanding how to put a racial equity framework when we're talking about policies to address this issue. What does that mean? This year, the world is battling a global pandemic with life-threatening results. We're dealing with a 2020 decennial census in the United States of America that's going to determine the allocation of billions of federal dollars for services for the American people. We have a general election this year without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. We have seen across the board the underrepresentation of minority communities, and that has done a disservice to the full ability of Black people to take, and minorities at large, and low-income white Americans to take full benefits of their rights. And this is problematic. And we need to understand that when you establish policies to try to address the problem, you have to understand what the disproportionate effects mean. Public policy does not, even though it's the same policy for all, it's not always received in the same way because people come from different circumstances. So understanding that white wealth is 13 times that of Black wealth, and you're understanding that unemployment is for whites is twice as low as it is, for blacks, means that when you establish policies to address that, like the stimulus package, you're actually taking that extra step to understand, to make it accessible, you've got to do a little bit more to certain communities who are disproportionately affected by attaining them.
Indeed. All right, Menna, and we'll have to leave it there with the both of you, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your morning to speak to us and to share your expert insight with us. That was Derrick speaking to us from Bensville in Maryland, and Menna was speaking to us there from Cleveland in Ohio. Viewers, I'll be back right after this break, continuing this conversation with a new panelist. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing to look at those protests taking place in the United States against systemic racism and, of course, the killing of George Floyd by police. We're now joined by Swain, who is the host of the podcast Be the People. She's also an author. One of her books, entitled Black Faces, Black Interests, has won 3 national awards. Another, entitled New White Nationalism in America, has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. She's joining us now this morning from Nashville, Tennessee. Carol, thank you very much for your time. What do you make of how things have worked out ever since George Floyd's killing and what's been happening on the streets? Right, we now have even Republicans or those who have worked with the White House in the past, such as Jim Mattis and others, who have now essentially condemned the president for the way he's handled things.
Well, I would not condemn the president for the way he's handled it, because I believe that George Floyd's death has been exploited by the media and by the left, and that they have used it to whip people up into a frenzy. And we have groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter that are well organized, and they are inciting a lot of the violence. And so at the same time, we have peaceful protesters or people who are trying to be peaceful. We also have radical groups that are supplying bricks and incendiary devices to the people that are out on the streets. They are inciting the violence. And when it comes to President Trump, there is nothing that President Trump can do that will not be criticized. He was first criticized for doing nothing. In America, we have a federal system. The state and local governments are supposed to be in charge of keeping order. It's not the role of the president to send in the military. So President Trump was criticized for doing nothing. And when he did say that in those states and cities where the people were not being protected, that he would send in the military, then all of a sudden he was accused of being a dictator. So there's no way that this president can win.
So then how does, if we go to the root cause issue, right, which lets us hone in on the peaceful protesters and their demands, right? So if we're talking about systemic racism, and this has been a long-standing issue, as I'm sure you can well appreciate, of course, how does one tackle that? Is this the time? Will this be a turning point?
Well, I mean, in America, everything is about race, and I would say that the racism cuts in more than one direction, that race is often exploited. And so the racism that gets played up in America doesn't always reflect the reality. If you look at the actual number of police killings of black men or black women, they have been steadily going down. And I believe that, like, maybe it was last year, there were maybe like a very low number. So we make progress. But when we do have an incident like George Floyd, it gets played up by the media, and it creates a lot of fear among black people because they believe that the police have targeted them, the police is out there just trying to kill black people, and that's not the true reality. And if you look at America, we have made tremendous progress over the last, over the last 100 years or so, and especially in the last, 2 decades. We've had a black president. We've had 2 black attorney generals. We have black politicians leading those cities that have become so dysfunctional. And there's a responsibility that cuts both ways. I think part of what's wrong in America is a moral problem. It's not just about inequality. It's about people's morality, their values. And in the black community, there is a segment of people that exploit race, they incite violence, they make demands, and they're not being very constructive. And the messages they send are quite negative.
Okay, so then what exactly happens next then, right? We've had these 4 officers being charged. One of their charges has been increased to, I believe, 2nd degree now. Will that, do you think, be enough for proper justice in that case? Because that's also been an issue which many point to as being problematic in previous cases, right? Where officers have either been let go because of qualified immunity otherwise, which I believe will also now be debated at some point in the Supreme Court.
Well, you have a situation, too, where in America, you know, we used to have due process and the presumption of innocence. And so when a person is accused of a crime, they have, you know, certain rights. With the officers, they could not be charged with first-degree murder. Some people wanted them to be charged with first-degree murder, sentenced to 25 years in jail. They wanted them, you know, jailed even before any type of indictment. So what will happen is that they will go to court and they will have lawyers, and those lawyers will make their arguments, charging the main officer, Swain, I believe, with second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. It makes it more likely that he will be convicted. And with the other officers, they will be looked at individually. And whether or not a second-degree murder charge will be leveled against all of them, I'm not sure, because it's my understanding that there was one officer that told Swain to turn George Floyd's body over, to turn him over, and that officer did not do that. And so the other officers that are standing there, I don't know whether or not they're going to be charged with second-degree or third-degree murder, but each one will be tried individually, and it would depend on the circumstances. Okay. There's a lot that, you know, doesn't get reported. When I saw the video, it didn't make any sense to me why he was down on the ground. And then later there was more information that he was claustrophobic. He refused to get into the car, and that there was a struggle. And that was part of why the first team, first it was 2 officers, they called for backup. Unfortunately, the 2 officers that came for backup were officers with a record of being aggressive.
All right. Carol, that I know that you have a busy schedule ahead, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule to speak to us here at Indus News. That was Carol Swain speaking to us there from Nashville, Tennessee, sharing her thoughts on this very important issue. We've spoken to 3 guests so far, our viewers, and we've tried to give you the entire range of opinions, because there's certainly, in the media right now, there seems to be overwhelmingly just one side being represented, but it's important to have the entire range of opinions spoken of, so we have a proper context and understanding of the entire situation, hopefully before we can make a final judgment on what really may be happening. As our earlier guest spoke about, certainly Donald Trump and the way he's handled this is being debated right now. As Carol said, maybe we are being unfair to the president, and he's trying to do the best he can within the situation that he is now faced with. However, of course, the long-standing issue of systemic racism in the U.S. and how the establishment views its African-American community, that's something which I imagine that all sides can possibly agree with to varying degrees. But of course, how exactly to deal with that and how exactly to tackle such racism is, of course, of utmost importance. Then there's the issue, with a very large issue, which we know of looting/rioting, which seems to be then overshadowing the peaceful protests, right? Now, as Menna there earlier had mentioned, the vast majority of protesters, by the way, are peaceful. But what gets the news time, of course, simply because of logic, and that's just how things work in news, is the rioting and the looting. We don't see the peaceful protests as much as those who are destroying banks or normal shops or looting big department stores, etc. So there are, of course, a number of factors to discuss here. But the root cause remains racism, and hopefully one can hope, at least from a distance as well, that the United States will be able to deal with that situation, as will we all around the world in our varying vantage points. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UK and its role in the Iraq War. You remember that the UK wholeheartedly supported the United States when it went into Iraq under, of course, the guise of WMDs that Saddam did not, of course, as we now know, possess. However, since that, of course, invasion took place, there have been allegations against British troops about war crimes that have taken place on their behalves and through them in Iraq. Thousands of cases have been registered and filed against British troops. However, it seems that an independent investigator or independent investigators, plural, have looked into those allegations, and now there's only really one left, which probably will be dropped as well. That's according to the director of the Service Prosecution Authority, the SPA, because of lack of evidence, or according to him at least, the low level of offense. Now, at the same time, the International Criminal Court is also investigating the role of UK troops in Iraq, as well as, of course, other troops in Iraq and, of course, in other war zones around the world, no doubtedly. Also, on top of this, then, there's political pressure on the government to pass some sort of legislation to better protect, quote unquote, troops who do go into battlefields, so that they cannot then be brought to in front of courts in such a fashion that there be time limits. I believe it's 5 years that has been requested. Human rights groups certainly concerned about that, saying that the military should not be above the law. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Nicolai Due-Gundersen, who is with the United Nations Institute for Training and he's the author of The Privatization of Warfare. He's joining us now from London. Joining us from Oxford is Frank Ledwidge, who is a senior lecturer in law and strategy at Portsmouth University. He's author of Losing Small Wars, British Military Failure in Iraq and Afghanistan. And joining us from Stoke-on-Trent is senior lecturer at Birmingham City University and principal researcher of the Iraq body count, Lily Hamourtziadou. Lily, Frank, and Nicolai, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Frank, let me start with you. What do you make of these thousands of cases brought forth against British troops and only one remaining, and that too probably, according to Mr. Haley, will be dropped? What does that say about accountability within British troops?
Well, accountability for British armed forces, in fact, all British armed forces, is notably poor, I think, by good international standards. The trouble here is that this matter has been mishandled from the start by the government. I know several people who've been accused, most of them for vexatious claims, as the government put it. They were offered no defence facilities, and the investigations were palpably inadequate from the start. Consequently, we fall to this situation now, where political pressure has resulted in, as you've put it, no doubt my colleagues here will agree, we've come to a rather pretty pass where there'll be no accountability at all for what undoubtedly were few but significant criminal activities there in Iraq, I mean. The danger, of course, is, well, perhaps we'll come on to that later.
Sure. Lily, thoughts on this? This is tough, isn't it? Because certainly you want to ensure that anyone accused is given due process, given the right to defend themselves, etc. Do you also think this has been mishandled? And then what should happen going forward?
Well, first of all, I think the issue of accountability is misplaced in the sense that, look, for 17 years, I've been documenting civilian deaths in Iraq, and I have found that around 25,000 civilians have been killed by the coalition. Not Britain, but by the coalition. Whose fault is that? Whose responsibility? Who is accountable? Are we going to hold the soldiers accountable? Because that, to me, is a mistake. The soldiers tend to follow a strategy, orders given of how to conduct themselves, how to conduct air raids, who to shoot at when challenged, who to bomb because they're suspicious, and therefore accountability has to go much higher than the soldier, than the troops. And that is something that is not going to happen because it never happens in the UK, and it wouldn't happen in the USA, because that would undermine the whole narrative of the war on terror. These are my initial thoughts on the issue of accountability.
And Nicolai, what do you think of this? Because, you know, accountability of some sort would need to be very important from the foreign policy point of view, right? Because Iraqis, especially those whose families have been affected very directly by any such abuses and or war crimes, would want there to be accountability to A, be able to move on themselves, and to B, then to have actual, respect for or even belief in these countries such as the UK, who claim that they have moral authority over theirs.
Well, I think here we have the issue of wrongdoing versus perceived wrongdoing, and also the tug of war between accountability and political legitimacy of any forces foreign forces, that is to say, that are in Iraq for whatever reason. So I think here we have the issue of, since 2003, armed forces, especially the U.S. armed forces, but also UK armed forces, have not necessarily been seen as trustworthy. Now, I'm not saying that means that these accusations are all true, but we have here this issue of when the invasion was launched, and we can talk about whether or not that was legal, of Iraq. How did Iraqis feel about it? How do they still feel about it? We have had cases of private military companies and U.S. armed forces where people have gotten off on technicalities, or prosecution has taken years and has dragged on in various courts. So we have that issue as well, and this is a problem because you don't want to unfairly accuse innocent individuals, officers who are deployed abroad, but you also want to understand the Iraqi perspective of dignity and how they feel about not necessarily having any closure or justice as well.
Indeed. So then, Frank, how does one balance all of the above, right? Because as I put to Nicolai as well, the Iraqis must be watching all of this very closely.
Well, certainly. I would come down to a question of professionalism. And it's a mistake, and it's a common mistake made, that people believe who aren't involved in the armed forces that there's support behind this, or considerable support behind this kind of approach of what amounts to a failure of accountability, both at the lower levels and indeed, as Lily said, the higher levels. Most British professionals consider themselves to be professionals and consider themselves subject to the kind of laws and customs of war the laws and customs of war that do apply. And they find this failure of accountability an insult, many of them, to their professionalism. But I think, Waqar, you raised something, and it's been touched on already, right at the start of this piece, which is that if Britain won't conduct its investigations properly and apply appropriate accountability, there's a serious risk that the ICC will. Be very interesting to hear what Lily thinks about that, whether that's going to happen. And of course, if that accountability is applied, it will not involve directly junior soldiers. It will involve senior officers and indeed possibly senior politicians. And some of us would like to see that very seriously considered.
Okay, so let's talk then about the ICC, because if the U.S., and I'm just using the U.S. as an example, right? The U.S. has been very against the ICC coming in and investigating its troops, and that was in the context of Afghanistan, I believe. Do you think that the UK would be as prone to standing against such an issue? Should the international community, do you think, be the one that takes the reins in this case?
Well, I don't believe so, because the international community may want to do a number of things, but they very rarely happen, especially when they involve the US and UK. Again, nothing is going to happen, I don't think, that will undermine decades of wars that we are fighting and resources that are being put into those wars. This cannot happen. The most that can happen is occasionally a particular soldier may be tried for something as though it were a soldier going crazy or out of control or a nasty person who committed a crime, as a scapegoat almost, when we know very well that this very rarely happens. I mean, in all these years, I've counted 25,000 civilian deaths in Iraq. Not one of them was caused by a rogue soldier. They're all caused by soldiers following orders. So accountability goes so high that I just can't see that being addressed at all.
You know, Nicolai, this is just, isn't it? Because this comes down to then the ideology around the time that this war was being announced and was just being, was beginning, really, wasn't it? And I'm speaking more about U.S. officials, but we can go back to even Tony Blair, certainly, and his arguments in support of it. But it seems that, at that time when we were going to war, there was a lot of media coverage, there was a lot of talk about this, there was a lot of enthusiasm on everyone's part that this was the right thing to do. Why isn't there as much enthusiasm, as much coverage about what the right thing to do now is vis-a-vis Iraqis and their lives? I mean, they're also to be, their lives are also sacred, aren't they?
Here we have a serious problem, which is to what extent does Western media actually consider Iraqi lives and the Middle East in general? I mean, there was a fair amount of support for the war, and there were analysts on Fox News and other places saying, we'll find oil in 6 months, the war will be over. My point being that there was a lot of focus on why we, the West, should go in for our interests as opposed to how does this defend Iraqis. And I think that as the war continued and it dragged on, enthusiasm was lost, but of course you still have security issues. And so we see the dilemma here that on the one hand, Iraqis may demand, understandably, accountability because there have been various incidents which the media has focused on that have led to outrage. But on the other hand, Iraq is a country that is still fragmented, and as of this month, we're also looking at the possibility of ISIS having a resurgence. So then, would you not need boots on the ground there as well? So we have this dilemma. If we look at current outlets, by the way, how the UK reacts and how the Arab world reacts, some UK outlets are talking about these vexatious claims being dismissed against so-called Iraq war veterans, British soldiers, who will no longer be prosecuted. Arab outlets have talked about Britain's Iraq war crimes probe, and now it's dismissing thousands of complaints. So we see here a difference of opinion, and it's not necessarily about who did what per se. It's also about the tension that was built from the invasion in 2003 up until now that I think a lot of Western powers have not directly addressed.
Yeah. Frank, I'll give you the final word. It seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that it seems that the West, or at least those countries that got involved in Iraq, are now trying to wash their hands clean of the entire situation, right? But it is still quite a messy situation that, whether we like it or not, was begun because of the invasion back in 2003. What are your thoughts on that?
Completely agree. This was the invasion, which, by the way, I took part, was a crime. It was a crime against Iraq. It should not have happened. And accountability has not been imposed on anybody involved, either at the political or senior military levels. By the way, just looking ahead, we're likely to see the same approach applied to the equally egregious activities of some elements of the British military, very, very few, but significant elements of the British military in Afghanistan. We're likely to see very much the same approach applied there, which is equally disgraceful.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there at that, but we do really appreciate Frank, Nicolai, and Lily for their time today and for, of course, sharing their expert insight on this issue with us. When it comes to accountability, right, it's about how you view the lives that have been affected, as I put to our guests. Are Iraqi lives sacred in the eyes of the British military, in the eyes of the British establishment? When it came to the Iraq war itself and beginning the Iraq war, it seems that there was enthusiasm. Everyone was gung-ho for it. Of course, there were many protests against it. But as far as the establishment went, Tony Blair went, everyone was on board, seemingly, in that regard. Why isn't everyone on board right now when it comes to accountability for those lives lost at the hands of British troops or other troops part of the coalition? As Lily there said, we can't just say it's only British troops. There were many troops part of that coalition from many nations around the world. There needs to be that accountability for there to be closure in this regard, for there to have in the minds of Iraqis proper understanding that, okay, these Western countries that invaded our nation and apparently, quote unquote, liberated us, they do respect our lives. They do want the best for us. That's an extremely important message for them to receive at this time or in the near future. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.